The promise of holographic entertainment has been around for many decades, with interest in them growing mainly through imaginative applications and possibilities as seen in science fiction. In the real world, though, the application often hasn't lived up to the dream. Holograms became a thing after the invention of the laser back in the 1960s. In reading into the history of holography itself, there are various names which pop up as making pretty significant contributions, including Yuri Denisyuk, Dennis Gabor, Emmett Leith, Juris Uptonix, Valerie Thomas, and Stephen Benton. Ultimately, though, the kind of hologram that one would find from all of those efforts and inventions was a 3D image on a flat surface, not a 3D object that you could see from any angle or grab and hold like in Star Trek's holodeck. In 1981, Atari was promising to bring holograms to the home with a new console that they were calling the Cosmos. But before we get into this device itself, we need to do a little more historical background. Why on earth would Atari try to do such a thing in the first place? Especially at a time where game graphics were pretty crude and the best that holograms could offer were rainbow-colored 3D images. It seemed like a bad idea. Let's cover some background, then discuss the device itself. Prior to the Cosmos, a trick had been used by various arcade games to produce a pseudo-holographic effect. This was achieved by placing a monitor flat down inside of an arcade cabinet, then putting an angled piece of glass or a half-silvered mirror inside of it. With a real background painted or modeled on the back of the cabinet, the image from the screen would appear to float in 3D above it. It's a pretty cool effect that you can't get at home without building your own arcade cabinet. One of the very first games to use this trick was Midway's Tornado Baseball, released in 1974. They also used holographic stickers in a game called Top Gun, which was an electromechanical light gun game. But you might have seen it in the far more common Space Invaders by Taito, released in 1978. There was also Atari's 1981 arcade game Asteroids Deluxe, which did this, perhaps better than anyone else had used the effect up to that point. Prior to Space Invaders, however, one obscure arcade company was also employing this technique and promising to change the world of gaming as we knew it by making the first holographic video games. Meadows Games was based out of Sunnyvale, California, and for a few years employed former Atari co-founder Ted Dabney as one of its principal game designers. He developed a Pong clone called Flim Flam and one of the very first-person shooter games, an aircraft combat game called Cobra Gunship. He had left the company before they did Inferno at the end of 1977, which was one of the very first firefighting video games, which also used that pseudo-hologram trick. In September 1978, Meadows was sold to a company called Holosonics. Holosonics had been on a patent run, or a patent binge, scooping up every patent they could get their hands on in regards to holographic technology, including one for acoustical holography. They promised to develop the first holographic video game, but a year later they had nothing other than millions in debt and filed for bankruptcy while selling themselves off in parts to pay off creditors. Why was everyone thinking about holograms when the technology just wasn't there? The simple answer was the release of Star Wars: A New Hope to movie theaters in 1977. It really can't be overstated just how influential the first Star Wars film was on American culture, particularly the subset of gaming culture. As soon as game developers at the time had seen the film, they immediately wanted to find ways to turn certain scenes in the movie into video games. While Atari would eventually land that coveted license and produce the Star Wars arcade game, that didn't happen until 1983 when Return of the Jedi had come out. Others who couldn't afford to have picked up the license still wanted to create something from the game, so you had games like Cinematronics' Starhawk or Exidy's Starfire to sort of reproduce some of the more memorable action sequences from the original movie. But there was one other scene in that movie that every game designer was drawn to. They just couldn't really figure out how to do it with the tech of the time. That is the holographic strategy game that Chewbacca and C-3PO play while on the Millennium Falcon. This was one of the first instances of imagining holograms as a new display medium that was put in front of millions of eyeballs. Even though the tech had failed to live up to the Star Wars promise, the desire to do something with holograms was there, so enter the Cosmos. With Star Wars in mind, the Cosmos project began in 1979 after Atari engineer Alcorn went to a meeting where marketing wouldn't tell him simple answers to questions, leaving him very frustrated. He went back to Atari Research Labs where he could design something new and exciting without needing to be involved with all the executive nonsense that had exploded at the company after Nolan Bushnell had been forced out and Ray Kassar had been established as the CEO and brought in a bunch of his own marketing people. Al grabbed one Roger Hector, who had been at the company for a few years designing arcade cabinets like Super Breakout and working on the Atari 2600 VCS. He also added Harry Jenkins to the project, who was a mechanical engineer. These three were the principals on the Cosmos project, while they got support from a subcontractor who had experience in holography to produce the actual plates. The company had also scooped up various available patents, many of which had come from the collapse of Holosonics. Because of all the loose lips at Atari that caused new products to get leaked to competitors, and with that Meadows Games and Holosonic situation in mind, Al initially codenamed the project as the Arcade Holographic Game System. When word would get out, it would be Atari's coin-op competitors thinking that they had to try and do something to catch up, but they certainly didn't have the means to do so. It was a nice head fake, as the reality was from the get-go that this project was being made for homes. It'd also be looking to compete with Mattel's red LED handheld, the football ones that were very popular at the end of the 70s, and Coleco's mini single-game consoles that didn't connect to a TV. With approval from upper management in place, there was one stipulation. It had to be a low-cost system versus the VCS. The 2600, as would later become known, was still their star product and would be billed as the high-end game system, while the Cosmos would be the low-end. The official code name for the unit at Atari was the EG500. Al achieved a lower cost by removing the ROM chips from the game carts and deciding from the beginning that all of the games, all 8 of them, would be pre-programmed into the system. Atari had done pre-programmed consoles prior to this, such as a volleyball/Pong type standalone and a couple of other standalones, including Pong itself, which Al had actually designed. That all said, this system would still use cartridges, just not in the same way that the 2600 used them. This is where the holograms would come from. They wouldn't have any other information encoded into them, such as the game. Again, that would be hard-coded into the system. The cartridges would be keyed to metal contacts on the Cosmos' motherboard, which would activate a keyed pattern to determine which game was being played. Among the games that were designed for the Cosmos were Asteroids, Space Invaders, Superman, Roadrunner, Football, and Basketball. Each cart had 2 holographic frames inside, then depending on which one was supposed to be the active scene, there was a scene A and a scene B, would activate one of 2 specific light bulbs, which would backlight the images. Those images were 6 by 6 inches inside, and then inside of the Cosmos itself there was a grid of 6 by 6 red LEDs, which would serve as the animated graphics. The estimated cost of the carts would have only been $10 to $12 each. The hardware wasn't anything particularly powerful or special, using a COPS 411 processor, which really just needed to control the LEDs and not do anything special like draw graphics on a TV. Now, making the images was an innovative but difficult process. This is from Atari Inc. Business's Fun Chapter 9, which is all about the Cosmos project.
The holographic plate design process for this consumer-class holographic device was truly breaking new ground for Al, Atari, and even the entire entertainment industry. Creating 3D holographic images isn't like taking a snapshot of an object with a camera. It's a complex process of exposing objects to a laser to achieve an image, and even then that image would have to be exposed at numerous angles, with each of those angles of exposure being processed onto a holographic plate. The exposure time for the laser would last for more than a minute, and the objects could have moved within a quarter of the wavelength of light. Foam board, paper, and other material would have to be utilized to marginalize the possibility of motion, as even the slightest bit of movement and the object would disappear from the image being exposed. So the process for making the models required a lot of invention, as it had never been done before.
The console itself had 8 buttons: a start, a skill button, 1 or 2 players, fire, and then directional 1, 2, 3, and 4 buttons. The system was revealed at CES 1981, but Al, Roger, and Harry had to go and take orders themselves. Atari marketing provided little to no support for the event. There's an Atari Museum article which also mentions that there was a toy fair that they went to, but Kurt Vendel, who also wrote Atari Inc. Business is Fun, says that it was CES and doesn't mention anything about a toy fair. So I'm not sure which one would be the most recent one, but I'll assume it was Atari Inc. Business is Fun, since he interviewed Al Alcorn about those details. Now, back to Atari marketing, they would make sure that the Cosmos, despite getting 8,000 orders at the CES show and winning the CES award for 1981, would make sure that the project was permanently canned. Yes, there was a flyer and a box made for it, and there were supposed to be 250 units that had been manufactured for a pilot run, but those were just bones that they threw at Al before killing it and shutting down the holography department. It wasn't because it lacked viability, it was because the marketing department saw it as a threat to the 2600, which was now the golden goose for the company. And this would not be the only thing that they would kill that was innovative that they felt threatened the 2600's dominance. Only 6 units appeared to have survived of the Cosmos as Atari went in and after the project was canceled and threw out all of the existing units that had been created for it. But Roger Hector, who had been on the project working as the designer, had several of them that he was able to grab before all that happened, but unfortunately his wife threw them out at one point. And so I think he only had maybe one left. Kurt Vendel, who passed away several years ago, did have a working Cosmos unit, but otherwise what's out there is generally not working at all. It should be noted that the stifling atmosphere that was growing at Atari thanks to the marketing department and other management decisions, it led to a brain drain at the company. There had already been some of this that fell out of the fact that Atari refused to give any credit to its engineers for the games that they created. But for Al Alcorn, this was the last straw, and he actually left the company by the end of 1981. And one could argue that losing all of this innovative and creative talent is what led to the company to collapse only by 1983. Also of note, there was another tabletop console in development called the Spectre, which used rotating drums to create a holographic image, but it didn't make it as far as the Cosmos did before Kassar also killed the entire holography department at Atari, also known as Holo Optics. So there you go, there's a history of another unreleased Atari game console, and it would have been rather interesting, even though somewhat limited due to the pre-programmed nature of it all. But had it been a major success, then I would imagine they would have come out with maybe a Cosmos 2 with more pre-programmed games in it, perhaps 16 instead of 8, anything like that. Or if it was enough of a success, then it perhaps could have had ROM-based cartridges. But what do you think about this long-lost, dead project? Do you think Atari was wise in killing it off? Was the marketing department right? Or were they short-sighted and stupid to have done so? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you on the next video.